Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Money Talk with Skylar Fleming. This week, let's talk about how your personal finances are going to help you or impact you in the future. And there's a lot of directions we can go with this episode, and there's a lot to cover. So, what are those things we're going to cover today? Well, the first one is what are the future ramifications and impacts of having your finances in order? Second is what can happen if you don't have your money under control in the future. And third, let's discuss how you can plan for the future today. And then fourth, let's take a very, very long-term approach and look at your finances. But I think today's episode is going to be a great one. We're going to talk about a whole lot of things, but what are you going to talk about with your friends after today's episode? Well, the money talking points from today's episode are, what is my ultimate long-term vision of my financial situation? And that can lead as a sub-question to where would I like to see myself in the future? Second, how will I end up if I continue on my current financial journey? Third, how can I improve or help others view money from a long-term perspective? But now that we have our perspective for this episode all in alignment, let's get right into today's episode. You know, we don't talk about money enough. It is a topic that gets ignored for some reason, even though it plays a role in everyone's day-to-day life. Well, this issue is what brought Money Talk to reality. I know you're probably busy and don't have much time to research and learn about all things when it comes to personal finances, but that's where this podcast, Money Talk, comes into play. I'm your host, Skylar Fleming. I'm here to do the research and learn all the extra stuff about personal finance for you. The goal is to simply get us talking about money. So let's get talking. So let's define what we're going to talk about today. Well, we're going to cover things like future planning and how you can prepare your financial situation right now for leaving a long-term legacy and a long-term impact. Think about your grandkids. Think that kind of long-term. And that's where we're going to go in today's episode. We're going to talk about future planning in terms of compound interest and how compound interest has so much power for our money. And one of the great things that I like to talk about is the term aggregation of marginal gains, or getting 1% better. And if you've ever listened to Atomic Habits, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a great book. Make sure you check that out. But also, if you've ever listened to the Choose FI podcast, they have some great episodes on getting 1% better and getting 1% better in a lot of little areas and how that can lead to some great long-term growth and improvements on our lives. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about future planning. And I think that's a really exciting topic because it gives you the ability, like I've said a lot, to just dream and to be like, hey, I want to do this with my life. So let's think about and start from a long-term perspective on today's episode. But let's next talk about the impact that this long-term planning is going to have on your future. So how can your financial situation have an impact? Well, it can have an impact on your family for generations, both good and bad. Let's take a look at the bad aspect first. If you're struggling with credit card debt or payday loans or buried in student loan debt and you have no intentions or plan to get out of it, it can paint a picture to children or parents or just your family in general that debt is something that's okay to just live with and get by. And then when you run into a tough financial situation, debt and being chained down by credit card debt or an auto loan can make your life very difficult if you don't have a plan for it. So there's a lot of things you need to consider. It can have a really long-lasting bad impact on not being willing to negotiate things like salary or pay or talk about pay and being underpaid. Things like that can happen if you don't have your finances in order. How are some good ways, though, that you can impact your future generations and family for a very long time in terms of finances? Well, if you're someone who talks about salary and makes sure you're getting paid fairly, that only impacts your family, but that can impact other people's families as pay transparency increases and companies pay fairly and well. But it also helps you build good habits that impact you as well as your family. So you learn things beyond money. You learn how to make sure to build a good habit, and you build a better foundation to develop better habits. So things like fitness, eating, social skills, etc., are all a lot easier to develop when you don't have to worry about money. And this goes back to our episode quite a few weeks ago about can money buy happiness? Well, no, not directly, but being confident and in control with your money allows you to be in situations where you're a whole lot happier, whether it's You're able to enjoy social settings a whole lot more because you're not worried about how much you're spending because you have it well budgeted. Or when you go out to eat, you're able to enjoy a really nice meal. Or you know how to develop a plan to stick to your budget that allows you to eat healthier, but also meal plan for work lunches and things like that, so that you have all of your eating under control. And then fitness. You want to live for a really long time, so you have a long time to spend this money that you're working so hard to save. So now you develop better habits with fitness. And I hope you can see just how having your finances in order can leave a large impact on your life in many areas, as well as impact on others' lives and your family for generations. But what if you have your finances in order? What are the future ramifications and long-term impacts of that? So what are the future ramifications of having your finances in order? Well, it leads to long-term wealth. It leads to long-term generational wealth of where you're teaching and passing down these good financial habits. And it leads to your grandkids still being wealthy, but also knowing the value of that money. And that's probably one of the hardest things of this long-term view is how do you teach the things that you're learning and that you enjoy learning about and that you're doing and working so hard to save towards? How do you teach those sort of things? That's probably one of the main things that can come up when you're trying to prepare a family for a wealthy financial future. But let's also look at it from the aspect of not having your finances in order. And that can lead to poverty. It can lead to being buried in debt and being super sorry for yourself, and that leading to very bad habits. Like you're not able to maintain your fitness because you can't afford a gym membership, or you can't afford good food. So you don't have a good fitness level or eating habits. And poverty can lead you down a very bad road if you don't have your finances in order. It can lead you to be in crazy amounts of debt, having your car repoed, your house foreclosed on and taken. There's a whole lot that can happen, but I'm exaggerating, of course, on both sides. Like wealth can lead to big long-term wealth, or poverty can lead to a terrible life, but you can also land happily in the middle and live a great and fulfilling life. You can save a whole lot of money for retirement, but you can also live now and enjoy your money now. But let's look at some of these points in more detail. You can have great wealth, especially if you plan well and invest well now. And this is where I talk about your grandkids. You can build wealth that will last that long if you work hard and plan and save because of the power of compound interest. But you can also find yourself or your family in poverty if you're not planning and living smart with your money and not keeping your finances in order for the future. So how does that happen? Well, if you listen to the big banks and try to play their game, if you carry a credit card balance, get payday loans, or if you don't even try to change your habits or teach your habit, if you teach your habits and your bad habits to future generations, that's how you can land yourself in poverty and find your family in poverty. And I'm sure, and I know there's a whole lot more that goes into it than that. I'm just looking at it from a financial aspect of if you're not willing to look at the long term and plan for the long term, because there's a whole lot of power behind compound interest that if you are willing to give it a chance and try to build some good financial habits, you can find yourself in a whole lot of a better situation in every aspect of your life, and especially in aspects of your family's life for generations. But what can happen if you don't have your money under control in the future? Let's talk about that next. So what happens if you don't have your money under control in the future? And if you're currently in a place where your money's not under control and you continue to live that way? Well, like I've been trying to reiterate, is it can lead to a very bad time. You can end up living your life on a monthly subscription. And how weird does that sound to say, oh yeah, my life costs $737 a month. Like, what do you pay for a subscription to live? Is that it sounds kind of weird when you say it like that, but paycheck to paycheck can also be a scary place to live in. And while I'm very lucky and blessed and definitely want to provide a disclaimer that I don't understand what poverty is like or what a truly hard financial situation might be like, and take that with what you will for what I'm saying about how hard it can be. But if you find yourself in a paycheck to paycheck situation, the stories I hear and the struggles I've heard from people dealing with it sound terrible. And it sounds like a really hard place to get through, and that there's a whole lot of freedom that you lose when you live paycheck to paycheck. It leaves you in a place where you don't have any real control over your life. And it can leave you with the inability to make the choice that you want to make. Like I commonly think about a situation like if you were trying to change jobs, but you're living paycheck to paycheck, so you can't afford a slight pay cut for a role that might help you a whole lot in the future. That was something that happened once I graduated college, is my previous job was paying more than my next job would be to start. But I knew my next job was where I needed to head for my career after graduating college. But it was going to be a slight pay cut. But because my wife and I weren't living paycheck to paycheck, we were able to make that jump. And now we're really happy in the place we're in and doing great for ourselves. So there's a whole lot of impact that comes from not having your money under control in the future. So how do you plan for that future today? Let's talk about that next. All right, so how can you get started today? Well, I hope if you've listened to enough episodes, you know what I'm about to say. But write down a plan. Figure out the aspects of your personal finances, each individual little area. Figure out how you want it to work, and then write it down. Write it on a piece of paper or print it, and then sign it if you want to make it an agreement and keep yourself accountable in that way. So let's talk about some very basic approaches to money and how you could incorporate that into your plan. So let's talk about the first aspect of how do you want to handle your money? So then there's some different approaches you could take. Do you want to spend it all? Well, then let's think about the long-term impacts of that. What are the impacts of that in 2 weeks? Well, in 2 weeks, you're waiting on the next paycheck, and then you don't have any money to really live on. You're waiting for that next paycheck to hit. So you may want to look at a new approach. So what if you want to save 80% of your income? Well, what are the impacts of that in 20 years? Well, then you're going to have a ton of money saved. But what are the impacts in 2 weeks? Well, if you're trying to live off 20% of your income, that can be very difficult. So you need to find a balance in these things by thinking about long-term and short-term. Too often, we just don't think about the long-term game at all. So let's look at it in terms of how do you want to pay down debt versus investing money? So debt can have a long-term impact in terms of how much interest you're paying the bank or how much you're not investing. But your investments can have an impact on whether your compound interest is working for you or not. So if we look at that in short term versus long term, in the short term, your investments aren't making any money. And in the short term, your debt can go down relatively quickly. But in the long term, your investments might grow well beyond what your interest you're paying. And in the long term, your debt will eventually be paid off with its natural course. So you have to weigh those sort of things to figure out the way you want to look at that. But let's talk about a very long term, beyond your long term, and how you can look at your finances from that perspective. Let's talk about that next. All right, let's take a very long-term approach to your finances and work backwards. So think about your grandkids or your grandkids' kids. What do you want their financial life to look like? What do you wish that you would have known, but at a way younger age? Now, think about how can you help with that? Well, one of the first starting points that I recommend is talk about money more with your family. Make it a subject that you all learn about together. If you're only learning about something when you're 40 and you find yourself saying, oh, I wish I would have known this sooner, and you have a kid that's 16, why are you not teaching that information to the kid that's 16? I know sometimes it's hard to teach kids and they don't want to learn about personal finance, but I feel like just discussing it, you don't have to try to make some sort of fancy lesson around it, but just discussing the thing. And I have an example to share this. My father-in-law is a really good example of this. He opened a Roth IRA, and when he did, he made sure to tell me about it. And he told me about how he invested in an index fund and how he chose that one. And simple conversations like this between us could lead to my brother-in-law or his youngest son taking an interest in index investing at a much younger age than even me, which can lead him to become very, very wealthy because he learned about index investing when he's 17 instead of 27 and didn't spend a whole bunch of time losing money on single stocks between 17 and 27. He just got started with the easy stuff right at the beginning. And these simple conversations about money can make it so that we all learn about money together and become better together. And it's really exciting. Just talking about money is an awesome thing. And just to think someone learned something little from a small conversation, and then over time it grows into a very broad amount of financial knowledge. So don't think you have to teach everybody everything that you know all at once. I'm on episode 48 of this podcast, and there's still things that I would probably like to talk about. I can't teach it all in one episode because nobody wants to listen to that. So just start with simple conversations about one single topic that you're concerned about right now or want to learn more about right now, and get started there with your money talks. But next, let's wrap up today's episode because I have some great news upcoming for the podcast. So I think that having a future perspective and a long-term perspective can be one of the best places to start when it comes to managing your money and thinking about your personal finances. If you have a decision to make when it comes to money, start way out in the future and work back. Think about how it'll impact you in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, then 1 year, 6 months, a few weeks, and so on. I think you get the point. This can be a great framework to get some basic points around the decision you need to make. If something leaves you broke and homeless in 10 years, then it's probably not best to make that choice. But if we don't even think about the future, then we can find ourselves in that place without ever realizing how we got there. So take a long-term approach to your finances. But there's some great news, and I really appreciate you listening to today's episode. We're on episode 48, and I have some great episodes planned for 50 and our 1-year mark with episode 52. So get excited about that, and please consider sharing with a friend. It's the best way to make this podcast grow. And guess what? We are seeing steady growth with this podcast, which is awesome. We're going strong for about a year now, and it's fun to put out these episodes every week. We just crossed 700 listens, which is crazy to think that my voice has been listened to 700 times by people on the internet, but that's awesome. And please, again, consider sharing with a friend because I'd love to see this podcast continue to grow. And there's going to be some exciting news coming out soon. So make sure to follow us on social media. You can search moneytalk.skylarfleming or Money Talk with Skylar Fleming on whatever social media platform you use, and you can find me there. Stay tuned for that announcement. But thank you for listening to Money Talk with Skylar Fleming. I'm your host, Skylar Fleming. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Money Talk. The Money Talk show is provided for informational and entertainment purposes and should not be used for personal or specific financial advice. Every situation is unique and different. Please make sure to do your own research for your personal financial situation.